IVM.
Hey, welcome to Shunya One, episode 42, which is an awesome number, and you'll find out why. Today we're talking to Mona Gandhi about the science of growth, product analytics, and why it's important, and a whole bunch of stuff which I think a lot of product folks will enjoy. How's it going, Amit?
It's going well. I think this was a really fun conversation. I mean, one of the things that came across is the grammar of this kind of stuff, right? The terminology. It changes as time goes on, and I think it's very valuable for people to kind of understand how that is as well.
Yep, and lots of insight into how a lot of folks in India may be doing it wrong.
Yeah, which is not surprising.
Yes. But interestingly, lots of feedback about our last episode as well.
Yes, we do. We had some comments on the Slack channel. Let me go through them really quick. So Bipin was the first guy to respond to the episode, and he said, "Hey guys, another great episode. Now more people and companies have started to give importance to design and not just having blue color. It was great to hear from a designer's perspective on design." It was great to hear a designer's perspective on design. Yes, it was. Today I learned for a long time Japan didn't have a word for green. The podcast also helps in improving one's GK, which I guess is true. I didn't know that until we heard that in the episode as well, that there is no word for green in Japan. And we also had a comment from Vishal Shavanke. Must say one of the best talks on design. Thanks, Himanshu, for sharing insights in design. The best one was the painting anecdote for your philosophy of design workshop, and found that there was no green in Japan. Him as well. So I guess the no green in Japan thing is kind of the major takeaway that people have from the episode.
I hope there's a lot more than just that.
I would think so.
But it's interesting how all these folks we talk to, there's a lot to learn every single time.
Yeah, it is. It absolutely is. I mean, but I think that's the great thing about the kind of guests that you've been able to get in over here so far.
I'm lucky that people aren't getting bored yet, and we have some awesome people on the show.
All right, let's get on with the show, but before that, we have our first ad on Shunya One.
Hey everybody, we'd like to welcome a new sponsor, Storytel. Storytel is an audiobook streaming services for mobile and tablets. If you haven't heard audiobooks before, and you're a podcast listener, audiobooks are probably right up your alley. You can enjoy your favorite titles when you travel, exercise, or cook. There are great books over here, like the Percy Jackson series is available if you want like some new fantasy, or if you want to go for something old school or classic. You can get either Bram Stoker's Dracula, or you could get Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter series. Download Storytel today from the app or Play Store and enjoy a free 14-day trial. That's Storytel, Storytel, Storytel from the App Store or Play Store. Download today.
Hey, today we have Mona Gandhi. She was the lead strategic initiatives and growth for APAC in Airbnb since a long time. Welcome to the show, Mona. How are you doing?
Thanks. Doing well.
Yes, I know I have a list of stuff you've done before in front of me, but I'd love to hear that from you, because I think today we're going to talk about what growth really means, what the role really means, and how we have all been doing it so wrong. So, please.
Yeah, please school us.
All right. Hi, guys. I'm Mona. I most recently used to be leading strategic initiatives and growth for Airbnb at APAC. I actually started as the first female engineer at Airbnb in San Francisco. Back in the day in 2011 was when I was young. But I've been there almost 6+ years. And when I started, we were a total of 50 employees, 8 engineers. Everyone kind of focused on one vertical. Someone on search, someone on payments. I focused on growth. It wasn't called growth back in the day, but essentially that's what it was. And then for the next 4 years, I basically focused on thinking about growth from a paid acquisition perspective. How do you integrate that into product? How do you think about organic? How do you layer these things? How do you prioritize different channels? How do you think about them? So thinking about, all the different aspects of growth, taking user base from 0 to 10,000, 10,000 to 1 million, 1 million to 10 million. How do you kind of think about it? Wow. And how that journey kind of evolves in terms, as thinking about not just the numbers, but what kind of talent do you need to grow teams like that? What kind of problem statements you need to solve while you go along the journey, and then added complexities of Airbnb being a two-sided marketplace, added complexity of it being a global company, so different levels of localizations needed for different countries. Very unique problem for Airbnb, but majority of our transactions had people from two different countries. So, someone was paying in euros, but someone was getting paid out in INR. So how do you kind of think about that? So varying level of complexities all along the journey. So that's what I did for the first 4 years of my Airbnb journey. And then for the last 2, I moved to APAC. And the idea was we had great teams in the country, in the region, to help think about local context and cultural nuances. And then we had a great set of folks sitting out of San Francisco thinking about product and technology. But since they don't both speak the same language, things were getting lost in translation. So we would build product and features that were like 80-85% there, but there were just that gap of 15% that we didn't fully understand the local culture, local nuance. And so how do you kind of bridge that gap, right? And since I had technology as a background, it kind of makes sense to take that role. And so the idea was to be part of this region, be part of the growth story of this region, and understand what level of localization, how do you think about strategic initiatives from a growth perspective. And unlike, when we went from US to Europe, it was much easier because it was just kind of translation. Mm-hmm. It wasn't transcreation. So you kind of just,
Can you say that word again? That's an interesting word.
So it was translation. It wasn't transcreation.
Yeah,
right?
Transcreation. I've never heard that word before.
Yeah. Transcreation is basically, you take, at the heart, the concept is the same, but you kind of create it with a lot of cultural nuances in it. And you actually create a piece of technology, content, ad, mm-hmm. whatever it is, which isn't just translation of what existed, right? So it's not like just, hey, English to French, right. But it's like, hey, we know the concept of Airbnb, but we're going to explain it in a culturally relevant way in Japan.
Right.
We didn't really need that when we went from US to Europe, because people kind of understood the concept. They were familiar with it. But in Asia, we had to, because, what appeals to Japanese people doesn't appeal to Indians, doesn't appeal to Singaporeans. And so everyone had a different sort of cultural expectation or different aspects of Airbnb that needed to be explained a bit better. For India, for example, we constantly had to keep talking about how this was a trusted and a safe platform. Right. Versus in Singapore, it's about, hey, you get to meet people from all over the world. To Australia, it's like, hey, live a happy life and explore these outdoor things with hosts that, have been experts in this space and things like that, right? So we had to actually transcreate. We couldn't just translate. And so an interesting set of problems around that. Also, Asia is somewhat interesting in that we had to start thinking about, we had a lot of brand capital of Airbnb in the US, and that kind of just naturally translates to brand capital in Europe. But in Asia, we want a brand Airbnb, right? And so an interesting way of thinking about growth, because we are a two-sided marketplace, trust is extremely important. And so how do you kind of build that by association, right? So thinking about partnerships as a way to grow, right? Mm-hmm. So if everybody knows Apple. If I partner with Apple, then Airbnb as a brand just has more trust by association. Oh, okay. And so kind of thinking about strategic ways of how you do that. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is just also thinking about strategically from a product standpoint, what kind of localizations do you need, right? So, for example, in India, we had to fix the Indian payment gateway integration, right? Because every single time someone would pay, they would get charged a transaction fee on both sides. And that because Indians are price sensitive, you have to kind of fix that. Otherwise, the conversions just don't flow through. Luckily in India, the channels of acquisitions are somewhat similar to like Facebook and Google. But you go to Korea, it's, Naver, and you go to Japan, it's Line, and it's a lot of different things, right? Yeah. China, a whole different beast. There's no Facebook, there's no Google, so how do you grow, right? And so a lot of localization. So that's what I did for the last 2 years. Nice. And then So I've only really worked at startups. Airbnb is my 4th startup. I worked at 3 startups before that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about, all of this is, we just got schooled right here in the last 5 minutes about what growth was.
That was a very long introduction, sorry.
But I want to, I know I've asked you this before, but I want to, for everyone listening in, what built this methodical approach and science to growth, as you mentioned? What experiences of working in startups before this sort of gave you the perspective, which you could then channelize in what you did at Airbnb?
Yeah, so growth as a science is a fairly new field, and it's constantly evolving because it's an interesting intersection of analytics, product, and user psychology, right? It's actually understanding all these aspects to be able to grow your product. And I think what's fundamentally and why it's become important is, in the 1990s when tech was a new thing, internet was a new thing, your leverage was how can you build great tech? If you had great tech, you'd had leverage. In 2000, it was like, hey, tech is becoming easier. There's languages that everyone can learn. Now it's about how can you build a great product? Does it have a good UI? Does it have a good design? If it did, you had leverage. And most recently, UI design, even that's fairly easy to learn. Right. There's lots of resources. It's gotten fairly commonplace, right? And so now your leverage is great distribution, right? You may have great tech, you may have great product, but if you don't have great distribution, you don't really get much far, right? And so I think that's how this whole science of growth has come into play and has become important, especially for internet companies, right?
So how far is this from traditional marketing, right? it is
Good
kind
question.
of, it's sitting on top of it. You're doing it in a more analytical way, but it seems like you're taking over the functions of what were traditionally in the marketing realm, right?
Thank you for asking that, Amit.
Well, I thought I had to, right? It is...
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think it's a good segue into something that I've commonly noticed in India. I think growth is definitely a lot more than just marketing.
Of course.
I think marketing is a pie, is one part of the pie. I think it's definitely the seed of how you sort of think about growth. The way this is gonna get fairly long, but I'm just gonna dig into details because I think that's what is missing in the ecosystem. People kind of just surface level stuff. So I think growth it needs to be thought of fairly more scientifically and more systematically, just as you think about product development, right? So product development goes through, there are sprints, people have all this tracking, attribution, they understand whether the product works, doesn't work, whatnot, right? And I think if you seriously care about distribution and nailing that distribution, you have to get just as scientific and just as systematic about it. And I think because it's a fairly new field that's come around and just in the last decade, not many people have learned or think of this as science. And I think that's one thing that I want to kind of, encourage more and more people that seriously think about growth, or people that are leading growth functions in organizations, to think of it as science and not as a hack. Yeah. Just a random search on LinkedIn, if you just search for growth hackers, in India, you're probably going to find majority of the growth professionals calling themselves growth hackers.
Right. Yes.
You actually will not find that in other parts of the world because it's not hacking. The word hacking itself just makes it feel like you just have to get this one thing right and everything else is going to fall in place. Yeah. I don't think growth is that. Growth is a marathon of experiments. It's constantly evolving, and if you are a company that is, sky's your horizon, experimentation is going to be infinite. There is no such thing as I've cracked growth. Mm-hmm. You may have cracked growth for the level that you had set expectations for the short term, but it's never enough for the long term. Mm-hmm. You're going to continue to have to experiment, and so. I think that the way I think about sort of growth is a bit more scientific. It's a thought out process, and it is a combination of qualitative modeling, quantitative modeling, and then sort of along the way, how do you build these mini models so you know you're on the path to your North Star, right? Mm-hmm. And so in terms of the qualitative modeling, I think the fundamental question as a CEO and the founder of the company that you should ask is, how is our product going to grow, right? And you'll be surprised, even if you have a team of 5 people and you ask that question, every single one of us is probably going to give you a different answer.
Okay.
And that in itself is a fundamental challenge, because then that means you guys are not firstly aligned on how the company is going to grow.
Right.
Secondly, it's hard to prioritize because everyone is on their own agenda. And third, there's no common sort of prioritization scale of how you allocate resources. And so you may end up being spread too thin and not make enough progress. So going back to the question you were saying about marketing, when you start to ask the question of how your company is going to grow, marketing is definitely one of the seed channels of how you start, right? Because there's 3 advantages to marketing. One is that you can buy distribution. So as long as you have money in the bank, you can do something with it. Second, it's instant, right? So you're going to start to see some traction straight right off the bat. And that's actually a key requirement for a startup, because otherwise you just don't know if it's working or not working, right? So it's a great way to find if there's product market fit, right? And then third is, I think, with digital ads, you've gotten fairly good with tracking and attribution. And so it really helps you understand what your user base is and what the level of engagement is and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's a quick way to get there. But I think it's only as good as your retention engine is, right? Because you may keep spending money at the top of the funnel, but if you have a leaky bucket, there's no point. You're going to run out of it before you know it.
Yeah, as more time and again we have seen in a lot of examples around us.
Yeah, but it's also a common myth, which is, hey, retention is this metric that the growth team has to focus on.
Yeah.
Right? Or retention is something I'll deal after I have growth.
That strikes me as short-sighted, but okay.
No, but
that is how people think here, I think.
Really?
I mean, a lot of people, I've actually heard this time and again. I've definitely heard the first one, which is, hey, retention is not my problem. Retention is a problem of the growth team. As product, I don't need to worry about it. So, I mean, retention, if you just translate it into, maybe this is my, market, lingo of people heavily used by growth professionals, but if you just break down the word retention, all it's saying is how valuable is your product, and does it continue to give value over and over again, right? And so as a product individual, if you stop caring about it, there's a problem.
That strikes me as
bizarre.
It strikes me as dumb, honestly, because I mean, how do you know how valuable your customer is if you can't keep him, right? If it's just a question of bringing him in and losing them immediately, how do you get it?
And it is the product person's job to worry about that.
And I would have hoped more people to have cared about that before over anything else, because unless you have retention, you can't really do anything else.
And all the marketing in the world is kind of you're not. If you're doing a lot of acquisition, and I mean, today there's a cost to acquire a customer, right? So I mean, if you're doing a lot of customer acquisition, if they're all falling off on the back end, then I mean, it seems like you're wasting your money.
You are, but it also depends on how you can attract that, right? Because some people, that's also a common challenge with startups that are only really starting to think about growth, haven't really thought about it deep and hard, is they just look at metrics like, hey, how many new users am I acquiring? How many monthly visitors am I getting? How many unique monthly visitors am I getting, right? And so if that number continues to grow, they're like, oh my God, I'm getting 3x growth month over month. My company is on this track, I'm going to go raise a bunch of money, and life never ends because they just continue raising a bunch of money on those metrics. And luckily, the investors are getting smart and people understand that retention is an important metric to think about, but there are still some businesses that just thrive on new users.
Yeah, I'm sure there are some places where that makes sense as well, right? But I can't think of that many. It feels like it's cheaper to keep your existing customer than it would be to go out and get a new customer every day.
Actually, I don't know. I don't think I've tried to study this space for a fair amount of time. I don't think there's any startup I've seen that has gotten to any meaningful success without focusing on retention and only focusing on new users. I literally have zero.
I'm pretty sure there isn't. And this exact fact which you just mentioned, right? It's cheaper to retain existing customers is something which we all say this. And again, I'm putting myself in the same bucket that we all think this way maybe at some level, especially if you read blog posts about growth and if you read all these other data sources so that there are so many of...
If you follow Sheila Aditya's Twitter feed.
Yeah.
Okay, then. But the point is, in practicality, when it comes to executing, right? When you have a team, let's say you're those 5 people starting out, you're scrappy, you don't know what to do, you're, throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks. And then one day you have money and suddenly you say, oh, I must use this to show my numbers going up. So let us just use all the money in acquisition. And then that becomes a habit, is what I think happens with people.
I think it becomes a habit, but also, just to be fair to the founders.
It's this insecurity of, like, what if I shut this off and then my numbers go away? What will happen then?
Yeah, I think, but also to be fair to founders, I think, the challenge is the ecosystem hasn't evolved to the point where investors will keep giving you money without getting some key metrics back, right?
Yeah.
And so Facebook was able to raise billions until it made a dime.
Yeah.
That situation hasn't evolved in India. And so for people in India, founders in India, companies in India, they're like, okay, there are some vanity metrics I have to get to continue raising money and continue surviving, which is unfortunately the true state of the ecosystem, right? But having said that, I think you'll always see companies that do moderately well to companies that do really well. The difference is retention. Always. I think if you focus only on acquisition without retention, it's the fight to the bottom.
Yeah, and people always put this away for later. Like when the example you gave that it's not my problem, it's the growth team's problem. Most people don't have a growth team until much later. Or at least one which really works or knows what it's doing.
Yeah.
And we're always in that first few cycles of raising funds and growing. You're always thinking acquisition, let me increase the top of the funnel as much as I can, and we'll see about retention later. So do you think we've just not seen mature enough companies in the country so far? Everyone is at this early to middle sort of a stage, and even the Flipkarts of the world are, or maybe they are the only ones probably, hopefully worrying about retaining users.
I think there's a few companies, right? There's companies like Zomato, there's companies like Ola, there's companies like Flipkart. I think they definitely should be worrying about retention.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a combination of things, and this is going back to some misunderstandings and myths that I see in the ecosystem. Firstly, everyone thinks if you think about retention, they have to think about app. Like, I don't have an app, there's no way I can retain because I can't send notifications, and there's no way I can get to the user because most of these companies, you can use the product without logging in. So I have no information about this user, so how do I retain? How do I engage, right? I think the second part of it is, I think, like I said, unlike successful companies and using them as examples outside of India, retention is essentially finding product market fit.
Mm-hmm.
And companies elsewhere try to find product market fit before building a growth team. In India, it's actually the other way.
Yeah, it's I got all these people in this room.
They're my growth team, and they're going to figure out retention. So it's almost, the order of these things is not what you typically see in more evolved markets where growth is thought of as a science.
Right.
Here it's like, hey, I have this one guy. This is my growth team, and the head of the growth team is the one who knows how to optimize Facebook ads. Right. I'm not...
and social media, and... send push notifications.
Somewhat, if I have an app. Or he's responsible for designing that app. But that's what I'm saying. So I think the fundamental thing that is kind of missing in this ecosystem is, I think, an understanding of... Firstly, what does a growth team do? What is the right time for the growth team to be formed? And what are essential aspects of the growth team in terms of skill sets, in terms of mentality, in terms of, nuances you need as members of the growth team to be able to actually succeed, right? I think, again, I think it's just a matter of time. It's just a fairly new discipline even elsewhere in the world. It just hasn't gotten to here because there aren't that many companies that have such challenges. But I think as more and more internet companies are created, like I said, great tech, great product is no longer a leverage, great distribution is. And so how do you build that, right? And so that's going to start to become more and more meaningful in the next few years.
Right. In fact, I think that's exactly what I want to talk to you about, as what can you give us as an insight on what that framework really is. But I think we're going to take a quick break and come back.
Hi, I'm Ambika.
I'm Hoshna. Over the last couple of years during our travels across India, we've had the privilege to meet and interact with a number of passionate people who are involved in preservation or conservation of a local heritage, art form or culture, or even environment and wildlife.
So in this season, we shine a light on some of these individuals and organizations and the work they are doing, many of whom are using travel as a means to give back to their communities.
By showcasing these wonderful people and bringing their work to a larger audience, it's our small way of aiding their effort and giving you an opportunity to be part of a unique travel experience. New episodes of the Rediscovery Podcast out every Monday on IVM Podcasts.
All right, welcome back, guys. And I think after that session on schooling us, we still have a lot of questions to ask you, Mona. But before I get into what growth exactly is, I think that's the answer what we're looking for. I want to ask you about this one time where you worked in a company which had the domain socialmedia.com. And was that where you learned all of this?
I learned a fair bit of it, but yeah, it's an interesting story. So I worked at a startup called socialmedia.com between 2008 and 2010.
When it was known what social media was called?
Just barely. Twitter had started to get somewhat mainstream in 2007. So obviously, having the domain socialmedia.com is a big deal. And we only had that domain because it was registered by the wife of the co-founder in 1994.
Wow.
So the real visionary there.
Wow.
We
have to thank her.
Yeah, and basically the company did ads before there were ads on Facebook and Twitter and MySpace. We went 0 to 100 million revenue in less than 12 months and went the other direction just as quickly.
Wow.
Just because Facebook realized that they were sitting on a gold mine and they sort of cut off all the API access for developer platforms and stuff like that. So.
Wow. This is actually not the first time we've heard a story like this, especially I think we had someone else, Namit, mentioned about Facebook, using Facebook as a platform for e-commerce, and even that got cut off at some point.
Same for Twitter, right? Twitter was Twitter was actually the most abrupt platform on planet Earth, I think. It's just
and now, till recently, we also saw the same thing with Instagram. Instagram just switched off a lot of their APIs. I think this whole ecosystem, once it grows large enough, they figure out how to make money.
Or they run out of growth hacks. They figure out, okay, all right, someone else has figured it out.
Yes, let's just copy
Get
theirs.
inspired.
Yes.
Not copied.
But yeah, you have been at a bunch of fun startups, and all of them have got acquired.
They have.
So it's like that's a pretty impressive track record you have.
I know.
There.
I could become a VC, huh?
I know. You could literally actually just say I am one and they would give you the job.
Sure. Yeah. I've been fairly lucky. Although, they've gone through acquisitions. Some of them have been sort of a talent acquisition as part of something interesting we've built. Some of them have been meaningful businesses that have sort of continued to scale. So flavor of everything. And I think the biggest sort of aspect of working at startups has been just how fast you can run and how fast you can learn. And so I think I drank too much of that Kool-Aid and I've just constantly just been at startups. So I once had an opportunity to work at Google, but I decided to take Airbnb. So
I think it was a great plan.
In hindsight, yes, but not when I did it.
No, it might have seemed so. But again, that's where I guess you can talk to us about what growth means. What growth means when you're first 100 customers. What growth means when you have 1 million customers. So what is this? What can you tell us in as much detail as you can about what this really means? Because I think that's something, if you have to start thinking about growth as a science, we have to go beyond just blog posts and basic books. You have to, I think it's a lot of first principles thinking, as the saying is, right? I think that's also applied, the same thing applied to growth and not growth hacking.
Yeah, and I think everyone in this universe should stop using the word growth hacking, because honestly there is no such thing as hacking growth. It's a marathon of sprints, and if you don't have that mindset, you're not really going to see the full potential of the opportunity you're trying to leverage. So yeah, maybe let's start with something basic. Firstly, what is growth, right? I think growth is equal to distribution. It comes from a variety of different sources. Marketing is one of them. But essentially, if you were to think about, the way I would think about growth is, what kind of tactics can you use from a distribution standpoint that give you compounded interest over a long period of time, right? Okay. So what do you do today that helps you get one cohort of users that then lets you get a larger, different cohort of users, and that cycle just continues to compound. And I mean, if you were to think about the financial sort of analogy to it, it's like, if I put some principle, which is the growth tactics today the experiments that I run today, the insights I have today, how do they give me compound interest over a long period of times? And what along the way, how can I continue to increase this principal amount, right? And so as a company evolves and matures over a number of years, even those new principal amounts continue to give me more compounded interest. I think that's how I think about growth. And that's why the point I was making is people should stop using the word hacking, because firstly, it feels like it's a state of mind for a very short time. And secondly, it feels like...
it implies a single answer.
And I think it also implies that you can have just stop thinking about it. You do it once, and if you get it right, you just stop thinking about it. And
and it'll just take off from there.
Yeah, and that's the complete opposite of growth, right? Because growth is going to continue to evolve, and there are a variety of reasons it'll continue to evolve. One is the scale of your own business, right? As you continue to grow, you're going to kind of plateau the existing TAM that you're going after. You're going to have to find some other sort of adjacent opportunity. Second is there's going to be competition in the market, so you're going to have to find what your differentiator is. And then third is the usage of the product will evolve. So as the usage of the product evolves, how you address these users and how do you make your product more valuable is going to differ, right? How you introduce them to the product is going to differ. And so I think it's just as you don't think of product as a hack, you can't think of growth as a hack. I think that's how I think about growth. In terms of framework, I kind of break it down into sort of four main buckets, right? One aspect of growth is acquisition. Second aspect of growth is retention. The third aspect of growth is seeding any product, right? So what are your channels that just help get people in the door, and then it's up to your either the acquisition or your retention to continue to multiply that, right? And then the fourth is how do you quantify your growth multipliers, so you know how to prioritize the kinds of efforts that are in the pipeline, right? Because as a startup, you're always going to have limited resources in terms of engineering, in terms of product, in terms of design. And so if you have a good understanding of these four aspects, I think what it helps you do is, one, it helps align the team on what you want to work on. Second, it helps you communicate and sort of check on progress fairly easily. You're not sort of always being reactive to growth, right? You see, hey, Flipkart does this thing on growth hack and suddenly the numbers are up. Let me try this. If you have a larger plan for your, like a 12, 18-month plan, you're not going to get
sidetracked
with, which are fairly, it's a human nature to sort of get sidetracked by things that are working for other companies, right? So,
food tech is great. Let me buy a food tech company.
Or, Paytm's doing cashback. Cashback's everywhere.
Yes.
Make my trip 90% off hotels. Like, I don't know. Just say it's free. So, just things like that, right? And I think the third most important thing that it does is, I think it actually gives you a foundation on how you think about your company and your product evolving. Because growth is just helping you distribute the product, right? It's not building a whole new product.
Right.
So if you have a plan for it, then you know what features you want to prioritize, what features you don't want to prioritize.
A lot
right?
of this sounds like, what's a typical founder's vision, right? Is it something which you think starts way back as early as a founder and his founding team figuring out where they want to be and how they want this to grow? And is it driven down from then? Because it seems like when you come in, and the second question was also, what's the right time for a growth person to sort of join, or someone in the team to be nominated as the growth person? Do you think, like, when this starts at a later stage in a company, the person responsible is suddenly faced with the challenge of sort of figuring out, aligning all these teams together and having this one mindset and hoping that everything just works out?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that firstly, so these are sort of the framework of growth, right? And you're right that it starts with the vision of the founder, because ultimately you're trying to distribute the product, and product is the outcome of the vision of the founder, right? And so it has to very well align. Most growth teams that are successful have good alignment with their CEO or their founders, right? Because they need that buy-in. If they don't have that buy-in, you're not going to get very far. And so I do think it aligns, but I think that formally having a growth team is probably a little bit later in the evolution of the company. I think the first aspect of growth is, I think you need to figure out product market fit, which in growth language is retention. Right. Is if you don't really have retention, having a growth team that's focusing on top of the funnel to just get more traffic, more users is not really meaningful, right? Yeah. And so I think whatever duration of time it takes for you to kind of find that product market fit, once you have a good intuition and a good handle on what is the value your product is providing, and that the users continue to use it over and over again, and they continue to find that value over and over again, I think it's a good time to start to think about growth.
So does the scale of where you're at matter in that context, or is it, let's say, for example, you're a small app which is very specific, but you have a lot of retention with your users, right? But at the same time, you want to start growing that a bit, but your market is fairly small. So should you put or your total market that's possible is fairly small. Should you put a lot of effort into growth at that point in time, or should you or is this stuff for which is more like kind of stuff with scales?
So, one trend that I've kind of noticed from a growth perspective is products that are highly niche and have a very small TAM with good retention are typically products that have very high word of mouth.
Okay.
Yeah. And what that ends up happening is the organic growth just continues.
Right.
But then there'll be some point where the organic growth will stop. Yeah. But to answer your question is, I don't think there's like a specific, you need 1 million MAUs to start thinking about growth team. But I think I do think that you need to start thinking about what is the leverage your growth team can provide, right? If your major channels of acquisition so far have only been word of mouth and fairly organic in terms of other channels, what is your plan on answering this question of how is your product going to grow? Right. And if the answer to that question is it is going to grow because of virality, it's going to grow because of some email marketing campaigns, some paid acquisitions, some content loops, stuff like that, then yes, you need a growth team. Yeah. But if your answer is that, hey, I actually think that it's just always the product is well suited for it to be organic and be driven by distribution on social channels like Facebook and Google and whatnot, then I'm just going to continue having this 1 or 2 person team that kind of just focused on that, right? So I think that's what I'm saying. It's very important as in terms of the framework of growth is to first really answer the question of how do you think your product is going to grow and kind of have initial alignment, at least within the founding team, on how they think about that growth, right? And then what that does is it actually gives you a perspective on what are the skill sets you require, when is it a good time to start, do you feel you are lacking or have some gaps even within the founding team, right? That you should hire sooner than later.
Yeah, I think also what I'm trying to understand, and I think I'm believing more and more, is the mindset for growth is something you should have early on. you may not call it the growth team. It may still be the CEO or the guy who's responsible for, even if you're a small company and you're still word of mouth, you can still do a little bit of marketing. You can still have, the way you do marketing can still be from a growth mindset.
Right.
Like the fact that, okay, I have to find product market fit first. What do I do to find that? What do I do to go out there? How do I talk to my customers? How do I talk to my users? That mindset is something which is essential to being able to figure out growth later. Do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think mindset
instead of just thinking, oh, don't worry, once I get some money, I'm just going to buy all my other users and it'll all work.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's very important. If you're in it for the long run, which hopefully you are as a founder, you are thinking about getting to scale in some meaningful way because you know the money is going to dry out pretty fast. But of course, when the money hits the bank, there is temptation to at least get some instant gratification on whether the product is working or not, and that's fair. And I think you should definitely leverage that because there's always first movers advantage. There's always a bunch of other things that come with it. But I think, like I said, and I am going to sound like a dead box, but I think unless you don't figure out product market fit, unless you don't have retention, it doesn't matter what dollars you spend. You're just gonna be on the short end of the stick, right? So, but mindset is definitely important. I think it typically comes from the founding team. The importance of it, of how much you care about it, comes from the founding team. So mindset is definitely important. And also, I think going back to the point you were making about it coming from founders, I think it's also an important aspect that people think about in the growth leads that they hire. So, I think typical sort of typical characteristics that I've seen of successful people doing growth is they're always curious. They're always asking why, right? Hopefully they have little to no ego because 80% of what they will do is going to fail, and they should be okay letting that go, right? You can get attached to an experiment and somehow try to find data to support it that it works. Because it does happen very often.
You put a lot of effort into something and you're seeing marginal returns on it compared to what you're getting elsewhere.
Yeah.
You're like, maybe we can fix this.
You
know what I mean? Like that.
Yeah. And then third is, I think you have to have this mindset of persevering, of being able to constantly keep trying till you find something. Because maybe the second try you do something, you'll find something. Maybe it's 200 tries later. You don't know. But the point is you need to be able to sustain that and persevere through it. And so typically, their growth leads are, or at least the product managers for the growth teams are generally people that are ex-founders in companies that have the same kind of characteristics, that are kind of curious to ask, why is this working?
I was actually going to say that. I mean, it sounds exactly like a founder role.
It is. And a lot of companies, when they start building out the growth teams, they try to look for internal hires that have those characteristics. So they've been ex-founders somewhere, they're either acqui-hired into this, have similar characteristics, and they try to hold them there. Also, I think as somebody who's leading the growth team, it's extremely important that you have social capital and ability to collaborate across different teams, because as a growth team, you're never going to have all the resources, right? You're going to touch a variety of different parts of the product. You're not going to build everything yourself. You're going to have to collaborate with other parts of the team. And you should be able to do that and communicate well and prioritize that.
I have a question, cycling back a little bit to what you were saying about experiments. This might be a little too specific to get a real answer out of, but I'd just like to know what you think about it. Is there a possibility of doing too many experiments? Because a lot of these numbers that you'd be looking at, you'd be monitoring as you're doing an experiment, those might get kind of like, mixed up in some ways between, like, you don't know exactly what is leading to what. So is there such a thing as doing too many different types of experiments at a time?
Only when you have too much money, as we've seen with a lot of startups.
Clearly. That's not my problem, but it occurred to me when you were talking about that, right? Because I do find a little bit of difficulty in telling what channel's leading to what, right? Because and our numbers are still pretty kind of clear. In that sense, I know that this is coming from here, this is coming from here, this is coming from here, but I still find there is some overlap, and so that I'm not really sure sometimes what's working and what's not working, or how well something is working. So, is there too much that you can do in that context?
So, I don't think there's such thing as too much experimentation, but I
Okay.
do think there is such thing as just experimenting for the heck of experimenting.
Okay.
Right? Like, there are some things that you just know are not going to work, but you just want to prove a point, and then you just kind of run an experiment. But going back to the point you were making on how do you, there are times when you don't understand what's leading to either success or not. I think it goes back to setting up the foundation of growth right. And what I mean by that is, I think one of the most fundamental things about growth is making sure you have enough, you believe in how you're tracking your data. There is a single source of truth. Most companies, as they scale, marketing will look at Google Analytics, product will look at some internal tool like Mixpanel, CleverTap, whatever it is, and then the CEO has his own dashboard.
Okay.
Everyone is looking at different sources of data. They all kind of somewhat say the same story, but only to kind of in a different way, right?
And when you drill down, the differences matter.
There's
then.
differences,
Yeah.
right? And those details are where,
It's
I
where-
mean, the
that's where
devil
you
is
get this,
in the
yeah.
details, right? And that's where you get confusion on whether this is working or not working. So I think having that is fundamentally important to set up a growth team. I think the second most important thing in terms of infrastructure that you can invest in is setting up the experimentation framework right. What I mean by that is the most fundamental aspect of experimentation is how you divide your user base to have, to sort of have two different experiences to know which one is better, right? Most times what ends up happening is let's say I'm running a A/B test on some content change, copy change, right? And it's just 50% of this user base sees copy X and the other one sees copy Y. And there's another experiment that's running at the same time that's changed the sign-up module to whatever. If I don't divide the user base right, there might be an implication of one to the other.
Right.
Yeah,
because
which you don't want.
Which you don't want, right?
don't want, right.
And so setting up the experimentation framework right, where you have confidence in how you're actually running these experiments
Right.
is way more important than running the experiments themselves. And if you have that confidence, typically a good experiment framework will focus on a few things. One is dividing your user base such that there's no conflict. Second is being able to determine statistical significance to know whether the results are something meaningful for you to actually make some decisions on. And I think third is making sure that people that are non-technical can continue to look at their data and make sense of it, right? Because you don't want to be kind of bottlenecked by engineers and like, hey, do this analysis for me and like tell
what's
me.
happening here.
Yeah. And so sort of communicating that and making that accessible to everyone in the organization. And I think once you have that, I think it kind of clears a lot of the doubts that you have, right? What then ends up happening is you feel a lot more confident in the experiments you're running. You feel that one is the confidence in the experiments you're running, and you know exactly why something is doing well and something's not doing well, right? The worst thing is metrics go up and you don't know why. Because then you're just like, oh shit, everything's working.
Yeah.
But it's really not.
No, and
there's
you have
only a
no
few
idea
things.
why, yeah.
I think
right?
this is actually like I think there's a quote from old school
It's from
marketing, right?
David Ogilvy.
Yeah.
Half of my marketing is working, I just don't know which half.
Exactly.
And that holds true for the digital world of growth as well.
It does, and it's unfortunate because unlike the traditional mediums of marketing like TV and OOH, digital is highly trackable. You should be knowing everything. I mean, at least Google does. So
Yeah. And now if you don't know what's working, that's your growth team's problem.
Yeah, no, but actually
You'll have a bad head
if
of
you are
growth.
primarily digital, you should know what's
Yeah,
working and what's
yeah.
not, right? I mean, that's an older television time ka.
Television, newspaper, whichever, right?
And so I think when you get to a point where you start to feel like you're asking questions like, I'm not really sure what's working, what's not working, I think that's a good time to actually step back and think about, am I tracking things right? Am I bubbling things and rolling things in the way I should be? Do I have the basic infrastructure set up to think about growth at scale?
Yeah. Wow. I think it's a lot of schooling for us to go back and do some homework on.
I think I need to listen to this episode again.
And then figure out our growth story from here onwards. But I mean, thanks so much for that, Mona. I think I think what you should do next is probably start coaching classes
I should.
for all entrepreneurs and founders.
Basically, how do you go from being a growth hacker to a growth professional?
Oh my God.
Yes.
I never want to be associated with anything growth hacking. I literally on my Twitter handle, I said growth unhacker.
Wow. But okay, so since you mentioned, where can we find you on Twitter?
I'm just Mona Gandhi on Twitter.
Awesome.
And you can
Talk to you
DM,
about
ask
talk
me
to you
any
about,
questions you have.
about growth and how to get there.
Yeah.
But if you do take up the idea about coaching classes on growth, I think there'll be a lot of folks who should sign up because we clearly.
I'll hold you up to that.
Yeah, because
we'll both sign up.
All right.
yeah, because we clearly think of. It's easy, and like I said, being a founder, I have done a bunch of stuff. It's easy to get carried away with immediately what's in front of you and sort of attack only those problems and not have a step back worldview on how this will really grow up.
Yeah.
So thanks for the inputs, and look forward to learning some more going forward from you. Do join our Slack channel where there'll be a bunch of folks who will be asking questions.
Yeah, you can go there to the website ivmpodcast.com/Shunya One. Over there's a button saying subscribe to Slack. And subscribe to Slack, and we'll send you an invite, and then join the conversation.
Fantastic.
Oh yeah, and also guys, please, iTunes reviews or TuneIn reviews or wherever you're listening to, please go and review, give it a rating, give it a review, whatever that is, that would help.
All right. Thanks so much, Mona, for that thrilling episode on schooling us. And like we had promised, I think this was episode 42, the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And it was awesome.
And we did get the answers to everything.
Exactly.
Yeah, I hope so. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. See you guys next week.
See ya.
There she stands, a podcast addict. Outside the bank, having traveled several miles to get in with other poor souls like her. The journey, though daunting for this youngling, will have some comfort because she has downloaded her favorite podcast. You can see more of her species on ivmpodcasts.com, your one-stop destination where you can check out the coolest Indian podcasts. Happy listening.